The realtor's pen hovered over the contract like a vulture waiting to feast, and I could feel my children's eyes boring into me from across his mahogany desk, waiting for me to sign away what they called Dad's worthless pile of junk so they could each pocket their $15,000 and finally be done with what remained of their father's life. But something in the way the lawyer kept glancing at that thick manila envelope marked confidential mineral rights assessment made my hand freeze halfway to the signature line, and when he cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Atwood, before you sign, there's something about this property your husband never told you," I knew my children were about to learn that their father had been far smarter than they ever gave him credit for. You have to understand, my Harold wasn't what anyone would call a flashy man. For 43 years of marriage, he wore the same style of work pants and flannel shirts, drove pickup trucks until they literally wouldn't start anymore, and spent every free moment in that workshop behind our house, tinkering with what our children called his junk collection. When people asked what Harold did for a living, I'd say he was a machinist at the plant, which was true enough, but it never captured the way his mind worked. Always thinking, always planning, always seeing value where others saw worthless scrap metal and old machinery. Our 3 children had been circling like sharks ever since Harold passed 6 months ago, not out of grief or concern for their 68-year-old mother, but because they'd already calculated how much money they thought they could squeeze out of selling off his worthless collection. Rebecca, our eldest at 45, worked in real estate and considered herself the family expert on property values. "Mom, you're sitting on prime residential land that's being wasted on Dad's garage sale inventory," she'd said during the funeral reception, not even waiting until we'd put Harold in the ground before she started pushing her agenda. "That workshop is an eyesore, and potential buyers are going to want it demolished anyway." John, our middle child, had been even more direct. "Look, Mom, I know Dad thought all that old machinery was valuable, but I've been researching online and most of that stuff is just obsolete industrial equipment. The scrap metal might be worth a few thousand, but Rebecca's right. The real value is in the land." He'd pulled out his phone right there at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, showing me real estate listings for similar lots in our area. "You could probably get 90,000 for the half acre, maybe more if you clean it up first." But it was my youngest Thomas who'd been the most calculating about the whole thing. He'd driven up from Atlanta with spreadsheets, actual printed spreadsheets, breaking down what he called the most efficient liquidation strategy. According to his calculations, I should sell the workshop contents to a scrap dealer for quick cash, demolish the building to save on disposal costs, and put the empty lot on the market before winter. "Mom, I know this seems harsh, but you need to think practically," he'd said, spreading his papers across Harold's workbench like he was conducting a board meeting in the very place where his father had spent decades creating and building. "You're 68 years old, living on Dad's pension and Social Security. This is your chance to have real financial security." What they didn't understand, what they'd never bothered to learn during all those years they'd dismissed their father as just another blue-collar worker with dirty fingernails, was that Harold Atwood had one of the sharpest minds I'd ever encountered. He'd grown up during the Depression, when nothing was ever thrown away if it might possibly be useful someday, and he'd carried that mentality into everything he did. But more than that, he'd had an almost supernatural ability to see potential where others saw problems, value where others saw junk, opportunity where others saw obstacles. I'd watched him buy broken machinery at auctions and factory closures, disappearing into his workshop for days at a time, emerging with equipment that ran better than it had when it was new. Plant managers from 3 counties would call Harold when they had problems their own engineers couldn't solve, and more than once I'd seen him walk into a factory that had been shut down for weeks, spend a few hours studying their broken equipment, and have them back in production by the end of the day. "He's got the touch," his supervisor used to say, and it was true. Harold could make machines sing. But what the children never realized was that he'd been applying that same intuitive understanding to much more than just mechanical problems. For 43 years, I'd watched him study everything from property tax assessments to industrial development patterns, always thinking several steps ahead, always positioning us for whatever changes might be coming. The first hint that Harold had been planning something bigger than anyone realized came 3 weeks after the funeral, when I'd been going through his desk, trying to organize the paperwork that accumulates over decades of marriage. Tucked behind his collection of machinery manuals, I'd found a folder labeled Property Development Research in Harold's careful handwriting. Inside were geological surveys, mineral rights documentation, and correspondence with something called Meridian Resource Management, dating back nearly 15 years. I'd called their office, thinking perhaps that Harold had been considering some kind of business investment I didn't know about, and spoke with a very polite young woman who told me that Mr. Atwood had been receiving quarterly royalty checks for mineral rights on his property since 2010. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Atwood, but I can't discuss specific amounts over the phone," she'd said. "However, I can tell you that your husband's contract includes annual escalation clauses tied to market values, and recent assessments have been quite favorable." When I'd asked what kind of mineral rights, expecting to hear about some small-scale gravel or limestone operation, she'd paused for a moment before saying, "Ma'am, according to our records, your property sits on what our geologists have classified as a premium rare earth element deposit. The European Union has recently designated several of these materials as strategic resources, which has significantly increased their market value." I'd hung up the phone feeling like I'd just learned my husband spoke a foreign language I'd never heard him use. Rare earth elements? Strategic resources? Harold had never mentioned any of this, not in 43 years of sharing everything from daily frustrations to long-term dreams. He'd continued going to work at the plant every day, continued tinkering in his workshop every evening, never giving any sign that he was sitting on what sounded like a significant asset. But the more I'd thought about it, the more it had made sense in a way that was purely Harold. He'd grown up watching men lose everything they'd worked for because they'd made their plans too visible, talked too much about their good fortune, attracted the wrong kind of attention from people who thought they deserved a share of someone else's success. Harold had learned early that real security came from keeping your most important assets quiet, protected, secure, and he'd kept this secret for 15 years, through medical emergencies and family financial pressures, through times when an extra $5,000 or $10,000 would have made our lives significantly easier. Never once had he been tempted to cash in early, to let anyone else know about the safety net he'd built for me. He'd simply collected those quarterly checks, deposited them into a separate account he'd never mentioned, and continued living as if his machinist salary was all we had. The realization of what he'd been doing, the years of careful planning and quiet protection, had hit me like a physical blow. For 15 years, Harold had been receiving payment for mineral rights that were apparently becoming more valuable every quarter, and he'd never said a word because he'd wanted to make sure this asset would be there for me, untouchable by anyone who might think they had a claim on our family's security, which made my children's eagerness to liquidate his workshop property even more painful to watch. Here they were, circling around what they assumed was their inheritance, making spreadsheets and real estate calculations, never imagining that their father had been protecting something more valuable than any of them had the vision to understand. They saw $15,000 each from a quick property sale. Harold had seen decades of security for the woman he'd loved enough to protect from, everyone, including their own children. The lawyer Rebecca had recommended was a slick young man named Davidson who specialized in efficient estate liquidation, which, I'd quickly realized, meant getting properties sold as fast as possible, regardless of whether the family was getting fair value. He'd walk through Harold's workshop with the air of someone assessing a condemned building, making notes on his tablet and shaking his head at what he called the excessive accumulation of industrial debris. "Mrs. Atwood, I understand the sentimental value of your husband's hobby space," and he'd said, somehow managing to make 43 years of Harold's life work sound like a weekend pastime. "But from a practical standpoint, you're looking at significant disposal costs just to get this property ready for market. The good news is that residential developers in this area are always looking for lots they can clear and rebuild on." He'd suggested we price the property below market value for a quick sale, arguing that the time and money we'd save on cleanup would more than compensate for the reduced asking price. "Your children are absolutely right to push for immediate liquidation," he'd said, clearly having been coached by Rebecca on the family dynamics. "At your age, Mrs. Atwood, liquidity is much more valuable than property." But something about his eagerness to close the deal quickly had bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Harold had always taught me to be suspicious of anyone who tried to rush important decisions, and Davidson's constant references to time sensitivity and market windows had set off every warning bell Harold had ever installed in my head about people who put their interests ahead of mine. So I'd called Harold's lawyer instead, the old-fashioned attorney who'd handled our wills and property transfers for decades. Joseph Jeffries was 73 years old and had been practicing law since before my children were born, and when I told him about my children's pressure to sell the workshop property quickly, there'd been a long silence on the phone. "Emma," he'd said finally, using the tone he reserved for important matters, "I think you'd better come into the office. There are some documents Harold left with me that I believe you need to see before you make any decisions about that property." That's how I'd found myself sitting in Joseph's office on a gray Tuesday morning, watching him pull out that thick manila envelope marked Confidential Mineral Rights Assessment, while my 3 children shifted impatiently in their chairs, clearly annoyed that I'd insisted on involving Harold's old-fashioned lawyer in what Rebecca had called a straightforward real estate transaction. Joseph had looked at each of my children with the kind of careful attention he'd perfected over 50 years of practice, then turned to me. Emma, Harold came to see me about 6 months before he passed. He was concerned about protecting your interests in case anything happened to him, and he wanted to make sure you had all the information you'd need to make informed decisions about your future. He'd opened the envelope and spread out several documents across his desk: geological surveys, contracts, bank statements, and what appeared to be a formal property assessment. Harold purchased the mineral rights to your property in 2009, just before several major corporations began aggressive mineral acquisition programs in this region. He'd been studying industrial development patterns and realized that your area was likely sitting on valuable rare earth element deposits. Rebecca had leaned forward, her real estate confidence suddenly looking less certain. Mineral rights? Dad never mentioned anything about mineral rights. Your father was a very private man when it came to financial matters, Joseph had replied, but he was also extremely thorough in his research. He spent 2 years studying geological surveys, talking to mining engineers, and analyzing corporate acquisition patterns before he made his investment. He'd handed me a document that showed Harold had paid $87,000 for exclusive mineral extraction rights to our property, money I'd never known he had, taken from accounts I'd never known existed. But it was the next document that had made my heart stop. A current market assessment showing that those same mineral rights were now valued at just over $50 million. John had actually laughed when he'd seen the number. $50 million? That's impossible. Dad was a machinist, not some kind of mining investor. This has to be a mistake. But Joseph had pulled out the bank statements showing quarterly royalty payments that had been steadily increasing for 15 years, along with correspondence from 3 different mining corporations offering to purchase the rights for amounts that ranged from $38 to $52 million. Your father turned down all of these offers, like he'd said. According to his instructions, these rights were to remain exclusively in your mother's name, with no transfer or sale possible without her explicit written consent. Thomas had been staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. You're telling us that Dad's garage is sitting on top of $50 million worth of minerals? Not the garage, Joseph had corrected. The garage happens to sit on property that contains valuable mineral deposits, but the real value lies in the exclusive extraction rights your father secured 15 years ago. The property itself is worth perhaps $90,000, as your children estimated. The mineral rights, however, represent genuine long-term wealth. I'd been sitting in silence trying to process the magnitude of what Harold had done for me. For 15 years, he'd been quietly collecting payments that averaged nearly $30,000 per quarter, depositing them into accounts he'd established solely in my name, building a financial foundation that would ensure I'd never have to depend on anyone for security or survival. And he'd never said a word because he'd known that knowledge of this wealth would change everything, would make me a target, would make our children see dollar signs instead of family, would turn his legacy into something people fought over instead of something that simply protected the woman he loved. Rebecca had been the first to recover from the shock, her mind immediately jumping to implications and complications. If these mineral rights are really worth that much money, then Mom needs immediate professional financial management. She can't handle this kind of asset portfolio on her own. Actually, Joseph had said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of protecting clients' interests, your father was quite specific about his wishes regarding financial management. He established a trust structure that ensures your mother has complete control over these assets while protecting them from any external claims or pressures. He'd shown me additional documents that revealed Harold had been working with a financial advisory firm for years, building a management structure that would ensure the mineral rights payments continued indefinitely while protecting the principal value of the asset. Your husband was remarkably sophisticated in his planning, Emma. He understood that real wealth isn't just about having money, it's about having the legal protections and professional support to keep that money safe. As the full scope of Harold's planning had become clear, I'd watched my children's expressions change from shock to confusion to something that looked uncomfortably like calculation. Here they'd been, pushing me to sell off what they'd assumed was their father's worthless hobby collection for $15,000 each, only to discover that he'd been sitting on an asset worth more than any of them would earn in their entire lifetimes. But what struck me most powerfully wasn't the money itself. It was the realization of how completely Harold had been protecting me all of these years without saying a word. He'd known that our children saw him as just another working-class man with no real financial sophistication, and he'd let them believe that because it served his larger purpose of keeping this asset invisible and secure. He'd endured their condescension, their dismissal of his workshop as a waste of space and time, their assumption that he had no real understanding of value or investment, all while quietly building something that would ensure I'd never have to ask anyone for anything. The meeting had ended with Joseph scheduling follow-up appointments to help me understand the full scope of my options, but the damage to my children's assumptions had been complete and irreversible. They'd spent 6 months treating me like a helpless widow who needed their guidance to navigate basic financial decisions, never imagining that their father had left me with more financial security than any of them had ever possessed. Over the following weeks, as word had somehow leaked out about the mineral rights assessment, I'd watched my children's attitudes toward me undergo a remarkable transformation. Suddenly, Rebecca was calling daily with investment opportunities she thought I should consider. John was suggesting family meetings to discuss coordinated financial planning strategies. Thomas had even offered to take early retirement from his job in Atlanta to help me manage what he called the family's new circumstances. But it was their changed attitude toward Harold's memory that had been the most telling indicator of their true character. The same workshop they'd been eager to demolish as an eyesore suddenly became Dad's incredible legacy and proof of his amazing foresight. Rebecca had even suggested we should preserve it as a tribute to his vision, apparently forgetting that just weeks earlier she'd been calculating demolition costs. What they didn't understand, what I was beginning to see with painful clarity, was that Harold's greatest achievement hadn't been accumulating wealth. It had been protecting me from exactly the kind of family dynamics that had emerged the moment money became visible. He'd watched our children grow into adults who measured relationships in terms of financial advantage, and he'd spent 15 years ensuring that his legacy would provide for me without becoming a source of conflict or manipulation. But now that they knew about the mineral rights, everything had changed. Family dinners had become informal financial planning sessions. Casual conversations had turned into subtle negotiations about future inheritance arrangements. Even their expressions when they looked at me had shifted from the patronizing concern they'd shown the helpless widow to something that looked much more like business interest. The final straw had come 3 months after that meeting in Joseph's office, when Rebecca had presented me with what she called a comprehensive family wealth management proposal. She'd actually prepared a formal presentation, complete with PowerPoint slides and professional graphics, outlining how the family could maximize the value of our mineral rights asset through coordinated investment strategies and tax planning. "Mom, we're talking about generational wealth here," she'd said, clicking through slides that showed projected returns and investment scenarios, "but only if we manage it properly from the beginning. You need professional help, and frankly, you need family oversight to make sure these assets are protected for all of us." The word oversight had hung in the air like a physical presence, and I'd realized that my children had moved from seeing me as someone who needed their help to seeing me as someone who couldn't be trusted to manage what they'd already begun thinking of as their future inheritance. The woman who'd raised them, managed household finances for decades, and somehow survived 6 months of widowhood was apparently no longer competent to handle her own affairs, now that those affairs included substantial assets. John had been even more direct. "Look, Mom, you're 68 years old, and you've never dealt with this kind of money before. The smart thing to do is set up a family management structure where you maintain control, but we provide the expertise to make sure these assets are handled properly." What they meant, of course, was that they wanted access to decision-making authority over assets that Harold had very deliberately placed exclusively in my control. They couldn't simply take the mineral rights away from me, but they could pressure me into sharing management authority, which would effectively give them veto power over any decisions I made about my own financial security. That night, sitting alone in the house Harold and I had shared for 4 decades, I'd finally understood the full depth of what he'd been protecting me from. It wasn't just financial security he'd been building, it was independence. The kind of independence that meant I'd never have to choose between family harmony and my own best interests, never have to negotiate with people who saw my assets as their inheritance, never have to justify my decisions to children who'd somehow forgotten that I was their mother, not their dependent. I'd called Joseph the next morning and asked him to schedule a meeting with the mining corporations who'd been trying to purchase the mineral rights. "I want to understand all of my options, Wawak," I'd told him, including options that might not align with what my children think is best for the family. The meeting with Meridian Resource Management had been a revelation in itself. The corporate representatives had treated me with the kind of professional respect I hadn't experienced from my own children in months, asking about my long-term financial goals and explaining various partnership structures that could provide income while preserving the underlying asset value. "Mrs. Atwood, your husband was quite visionary in his acquisition timing," the senior geologist had explained. The rare earth elements in your deposits have become increasingly valuable as global technology demands have evolved. We'd be honored to continue the partnership he established, with terms that reflect current market values. They'd offered me several options: an immediate buyout for $52 million, a long-term extraction lease that would provide substantial quarterly payments for decades, or a partnership structure that would give me partial ownership in the mining operation itself. Each option came with different advantages, but all of them would ensure that I'd have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. More importantly, they'd made it clear that all contracts would be exclusively in my name, with no requirement for family consultation or approval. Harold's original agreements had been structured to protect my sole ownership, and any new arrangements would maintain that protection. I'd asked for time to consider my options, but in truth, I'd already made my decision. Harold had spent 15 years protecting this asset for me, and I was going to honor his intention by ensuring it remained mine to control completely. My children could continue to pressure me for family oversight and coordinated management, but they were going to discover that their father had been far more thorough in his legal protections than they'd imagined. The confrontation had come the following Sunday, when all three children had arrived for what Rebecca had announced as a family meeting to finalize our wealth management strategy. They'd come prepared with more paperwork, more proposals, more arguments about why I needed their guidance to handle my financial affairs properly. Thomas had started with what he clearly thought was a reasonable opening position. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think the best approach is to establish a family trust with you as the primary beneficiary, but with all of us as trustees. That way, you maintain control over your day-to-day finances, but major decisions about the mineral rights get made collectively." What that means, Rebecca had added, is that we can provide professional oversight for investment decisions while protecting you from the stress of having to manage everything alone. John had pulled out his laptop to show me trust structures he'd researched, explaining how modern families handled substantial assets through collaborative management approaches. "The key is making sure everyone's interests are aligned and protected," he'd said, as if my interests were somehow separate from my own decision-making authority. I'd let them finish their presentation, watching them build their case for why I couldn't be trusted to manage my own financial affairs, before I'd pulled out the documents Joseph had prepared for me. "Before we discuss trust structures," I'd said, "there's something you need to understand about the legal protections your father built into these assets." I'd shown them the original mineral rights contracts, which specified that ownership could not be transferred to any trust or corporate structure without voiding the agreements entirely. Harold had been so thorough in protecting these assets that even I couldn't give them away if I'd wanted to. They were legally structured to remain in my individual name until my death, at which point they would transfer according to my will, not according to any trust arrangement my children might prefer. "Your father understood exactly what would happen if this asset became visible," I'd explained. "He knew that money changes family dynamics, and he wanted to make sure I'd always have the power to make my own decisions about my own security. But it was the next set of documents that had really gotten their attention, the partnership agreement I'd signed with Meridian Resource Management just 2 days earlier. Instead of selling the mineral rights outright, I'd chosen a long-term extraction lease that would provide me with quarterly payments starting at $200,000 and escalating annually based on market values. More importantly, the lease included provisions for additional bonus payments tied to production milestones, potentially providing millions more over the 30-year contract term. "You signed a 30-year contract without consulting us?" Rebecca had asked, her voice rising with what sounded like genuine panic. "I signed a contract that ensures I'll have substantial income for the rest of my life," I'd corrected. "A contract that your father's legal protections made it possible for me to sign without requiring anyone else's approval or consent." Thomas had been staring at the payment schedule like it was a personal insult. "Mom, you're 78 years old. You don't need income for 30 years. The smart thing to do would have been to take the lump sum buyout and invest it properly for maximum family benefit." And there it was, the assumption that had been underlying all of their family wealth management proposals. They'd been thinking about this asset as something that should be managed for their benefit, not mine. In their minds, I was just a temporary custodian of wealth that really belonged to them, and my job was to preserve and maximize it for their eventual inheritance. "The smart thing," I'd said, feeling Harold's presence in the room like a protective shield around my words, "was your father spending 15 years building legal protections that ensure this asset serves my interests, not anyone else's." I'd pulled out the final document Joseph had prepared, a new will that specified exactly how the mineral rights would be distributed after my death. Instead of the equal three-way split my children had been assuming, the new will created a structure that rewarded the child who'd shown the most respect for my independence and decision-making authority. Since you're also concerned about coordinated family planning, Fa, I'd said, you should know that your father's protections extend to estate planning as well. The mineral rights will pass to whichever of my children has demonstrated the best understanding of what these assets were really meant to accomplish. The room had gone completely silent as the implications had sunk in. Suddenly, their push for family oversight wasn't just about managing my assets during my lifetime. It was about positioning themselves for inheritance advantages they'd assumed were guaranteed. Rebecca had been the first to recover, immediately shifting tactics. Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not trying to control your decisions. We just want to make sure you have the support you need to handle this responsibly. But the damage to their credibility had been complete. For months, they'd been treating me like someone who couldn't be trusted to manage my own affairs, pushing for control over assets that Harold had very deliberately placed exclusively in my hands. Now that they realized their inheritance wasn't guaranteed, they wanted to backtrack and pretend their concern had been genuine rather than self-interested. John had tried a different approach. Look, Mom, maybe we came on too strong with the trust idea, but you have to admit this is a lot of money to manage alone. We just want to help. The help I need, I'd replied, is for my children to respect the decisions I make about my own life and my own financial security. Your father trusted me to handle these assets appropriately, and frankly, I'm disappointed that you don't share his confidence in my judgment. Thomas had made one last attempt to salvage their position. But Mom, we're family. Shouldn't we be working together on something this important? We are family, I'd agreed. Which is why I'm hurt that you've spent months treating me like someone who needs your permission to make decisions about her own assets. Your father built these protections specifically to ensure I'd never have to choose between family harmony and my own independence. The meeting had ended with my children leaving in confused frustration, finally beginning to understand that their father had been several steps ahead of their assumptions about family wealth management. They'd spent months building strategies based on the premise that I'd need their guidance and oversight, never imagining that Harold had been protecting me from exactly that kind of family pressure. Over the following weeks, I'd begun to see how profoundly Harold's planning had changed the trajectory of my life. The quarterly payments from the mineral rights lease meant I had more income than I'd ever had during our marriage, complete financial independence that freed me from any concern about medical costs, housing expenses, or long-term care needs. But more than that, the legal protections he'd built meant I had genuine autonomy, the power to make my own decisions without having to negotiate with anyone or justify my choices to people who thought they knew better. I'd used some of the first payment to hire my own financial advisor, someone Joseph had recommended who specialized in helping clients maintain control over their own assets rather than delegating authority to family members. I'd also made arrangements to travel, something Harold and I had always planned to do after his retirement, but never had the chance to accomplish together. Most importantly, I'd begun to establish new relationships with my children based on clear boundaries about my independence. Rebecca's offers to help with financial planning had become invitations to family dinners where money wasn't discussed. John's suggestions about investment strategies had been replaced with conversations about his work and my travel plans. Thomas had gradually stopped mentioning early retirement to help manage family assets and had started asking about my health and happiness instead. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. For months, family interactions had been strained by the adjustment to new dynamics where I was financially independent rather than financially dependent, where I made my own decisions rather than accepting their guidance, where my assets were mine to control rather than theirs to manage. But gradually, they'd begun to relate to me as an autonomous adult rather than as someone who needed their oversight and protection. The most profound change had been in my own sense of self-worth and capability. For the first 6 months after Harold's death, I'd allowed my children to treat me like someone who couldn't handle basic financial decisions, someone who needed guidance and supervision to navigate the complexities of widowhood. But Harold's legacy had forced me to recognize that their assumptions about my capabilities had been completely wrong. I'd been managing household finances, making important decisions, and navigating complex challenges for decades. Now sitting in my living room on a peaceful Sunday evening, reading travel brochures for the European trip I'd booked for next month, I finally understood the full scope of what Harold had accomplished through 15 years of quiet planning. He hadn't just built financial security, he'd built the foundation for genuine independence, the kind of independence that meant I could choose how to spend my time, where to live, how to relate to my children, and what kind of legacy to leave behind. The mineral rights payments would continue for 30 years, long after I was gone, providing substantial assets that would eventually pass to my children according to the terms I chose rather than the terms they assumed. But the real gift Harold had given me wasn't the money itself. It was the power to control my own life completely, without having to compromise with people who thought they knew better than I did about what was best for me. My children had learned that their father was far more sophisticated in his planning than they'd ever imagined, and that their mother was far more capable of handling complex financial decisions than they'd ever acknowledged. But more than that, they'd learned that real family relationships are built on respect for each other's autonomy and judgment, not on assumptions about who needs guidance and who provides oversight. As I'd started making plans for how to use Harold's gift, the travel, the charitable giving, the investments in causes that mattered to me, I'd realized that his greatest achievement hadn't been accumulating wealth, but building the legal and financial structures that ensured his wife would never have to depend on anyone else's approval to live the life she chose. The workshop behind our house still contained Harold's collection of machinery and equipment, but now I understood it differently. It wasn't a cluttered storage space filled with junk as my children had seen it, or even a valuable asset that needed to be liquidated for maximum financial benefit. It was the visible symbol of a man who'd spent 43 years thinking several steps ahead, always planning, always protecting, always ensuring that the woman he loved would have choices rather than dependencies. Sometimes when I walked through that workshop, touching the tools Harold had used and the machines he'd repaired, I could almost feel his presence, his satisfaction at knowing that his planning had worked exactly as he'd intended. His children had underestimated his intelligence and sophistication, his wife had been protected from their assumptions about her capabilities, and his legacy had become a source of independence rather than dependence. The quarterly payment notifications from Meridian Resource Management had become my favorite mail to receive, not because of the money itself, but because of what those payments represented. Each check was proof that Harold had loved me enough to spend 15 years building protections I'd never known I needed, ensuring that I'd have the power to make my own decisions about my own life without having to negotiate with anyone who thought they knew better. My children still visited regularly, still offered suggestions and advice about various aspects of my life, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. They were no longer trying to manage my affairs or provide oversight for my decisions. Instead, they were slowly learning to relate to me as an autonomous adult who'd proven capable of handling substantial financial responsibilities independently. The new will I'd established made it clear that Harold's legacy would ultimately benefit all of them, but according to terms that rewarded respect for my independence rather than attempts to control my decisions. The child who demonstrated the best understanding of what the mineral rights were really meant to accomplish, protecting my autonomy and choices, would receive the largest share of an asset that would still be worth tens of millions of dollars when I was gone. But for now, for the years I had remaining, those assets were mine to control completely. Harold had given me the ultimate gift of independence, the financial security to make my own choices, the legal protections to maintain my own authority, and the peace of mind that came from knowing I'd never have to choose between family harmony and my own best interests. Standing in that workshop on quiet Sunday afternoons, surrounded by the evidence of Harold's decades of careful work and thoughtful planning, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before he'd died: complete security in my own capability and worth. My children had learned that their father was far smarter than they'd given him credit for, and their mother was far stronger than they'd assumed she could be. The woman they'd thought needed their guidance and oversight had turned out to be perfectly capable of managing substantial assets, making complex financial decisions, and maintaining control over her own life. Harold had known that all along, had believed in my capabilities enough to build an entire legacy around protecting my independence rather than ensuring my dependence. And now, with quarterly payments that provided more security than I'd ever imagined possible, with legal protections that ensured my autonomy, and with the knowledge that I could live exactly the life I chose without having to compromise with anyone, I finally understood what Harold had been building in that workshop all those years. It hadn't just been machinery and equipment, it had been the foundation for his wife's freedom and his children's education about the difference between love and control. The deed to our property still showed Harold's workshop as a simple outbuilding on a half-acre residential lot, but I knew better. It was the visible symbol of a man who'd understood that real security isn't about having money. It's about having the power to control your own life completely without having to ask anyone's permission to make the choices that serve your own best interests. And that, more than the $50 million in mineral rights or the quarterly payments that would continue for decades, was Harold's true gift to me: the knowledge that I was capable, valuable, and worthy of complete autonomy, and the legal and financial protections to ensure that no one could ever again treat me as if I needed their oversight to handle my own affairs. My children had fought over what they'd assumed was their father's worthless workshop, only to discover that he'd been protecting something far more valuable than any of them had the vision to understand. But the real revelation hadn't been about money. It had been about recognizing that their mother was far stronger, their father was far smarter, and their assumptions about family dynamics had been completely wrong. Now, as I planned for the years ahead with complete financial independence and the security Harold had built for me, I realized that his greatest lesson hadn't been about money management or property investments. It had been about the difference between being loved and being controlled, between having family who supported your autonomy and family who assumed they knew better than you did about your own life. The quarterly payments would continue, the legal protections would remain in place, and my children would eventually inherit substantial wealth. But they would inherit it on terms that honored Harold's intention, rewarding respect for my independence rather than attempts to manage my affairs, recognizing my capability rather than assuming my limitations, and understanding that real family love means trusting someone to make their own decisions about their own life. Harold's workshop still stood behind our house, filled with the machinery and equipment that had been his life's work, but now it represented something far more valuable than any of us had initially understood. It was the physical symbol of a man who'd spent 15 years quietly building the foundation for his wife's complete independence, ensuring that she'd never have to choose between family harmony and her own autonomy. My children had learned that their father was far more sophisticated than they'd ever given him credit for, that their mother was far more capable than they'd ever acknowledged, and that their assumptions about inheritance and family wealth management had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what Harold's legacy was really meant to accomplish. The deed had revealed the truth about the mineral rights, but the deeper truth was about the power of genuine love to protect and empower, rather than control and diminish. Harold had trusted me with complete financial independence because he'd understood that real security comes from having choices, not from having someone else manage your choices for you. And now, with decades of payments ahead of me and the legal authority to use them exactly as I chose, I finally understood what Harold had been building all those years in his workshop. Not just financial assets, but the foundation for a life lived on my own terms, with my own decisions, according to my own values and priorities. The woman my children had thought needed their oversight had turned out to be perfectly capable of handling substantial wealth responsibly. The assets they'd assumed would require family management had been structured to protect my sole authority. And the legacy they'd thought they understood had revealed itself to be something far more sophisticated and protective than any of them had imagined. Harold's final gift to me wasn't just the money. It was the knowledge that I was worthy of complete trust, capable of complex decisions, and deserving of absolute autonomy. And that knowledge, backed by legal protections and financial resources that ensured no one could ever again treat me as if I needed permission to live my own life, was worth far more than $50 million. It was worth everything.